Today we hear just a few quick verses from the 11th chapter of Romans, and in them Paul again and again uses the word disobedient, referring to how it is that people are in relationship with God. And so I found myself wondering, what does it look like to be disobedient to God? And if you're going to say, what does it look like to be disobedient to God, you maybe have to have a measure of what obedience looks like. And so if we take today's gospel passage as an example, Jesus is talking about it's not dirty hands that defile you, but the things that come out of your mouth. And then he gives examples of murder and adultery and theft and slander and false witness. So if we want to say, what does disobedience to God look like, we could go out and look for those sorts of things. And that can be obvious, right? Murder clearly would be against the plan that God has for the world. We can look at the events of the last week and see people filled with hate marching around and shouting, Jews will not replace us, and blood and soil and all of this horrible stuff, and say that clearly seems to be outside of God's plan for love and peace in the world. So there are ways that we can look and see disobedience. But if you were looking for disobedience in the world, what direction is that going? Away from you, right? There are times where we ought to be paying attention to what's going around us and witness good news into those places. But a different question might be, how does disobedience feel? And disobedience turns from me looking out at others and turns towards looking at myself. And as I thought about that, I was reminded of Martin Luther's journey that was so full of angst as he was trying to figure out his relationship with God. He would go to confession, sometimes multiple times a day. There's a story that his guy that heard his confession one time told him, why don't you come back when you've actually sinned? And what that tells you is that he had a feeling, there was some way that he felt that he was not living up to what he needed to and felt disobedient to God. And so he was confessing that and trying to do something about that. And that's the way that, that expressed itself. Now, we can debate maybe, did he feel guilty about things he had done or not done to other people? Or did he feel shameful about who he was and somehow not living up to who he thought God planned for him to be? Now, I need a little help this morning if we're going to talk about how things feel. So much of our feeling comes across in our posture. What is a good way that if we're feeling guilty, how might we look? Slouch. All right. Anything else? All right. So we'll go with this is guilt. Like we're like, oh man, I really shouldn't have did that. So sometimes guilt feels like that, and it expresses itself in our posture. And it can be like that slouch thing of knowing that we're not doing what we ought to do. What does it look like to feel ashamed? Red face? Okay. What else? Do we want everybody to see us when we're ashamed? Hand down, right? So we maybe like, hopefully nobody sees me right now. So that's a different feeling. So we might have that guilty feeling when we know we're not living up to what God has called us to, and just kind of get in that place, or we might be more ashamed and want to go hide someplace, and hopefully nobody sees us in that state. Sometimes we can get to a place of that hatred and anger kind of place, and there is righteous anger that gets expressed certain ways, but I'm talking more just like we're not in control of ourselves, and that kind of gets to be like, Arr! Have you ever been in that spot? Right, and when you're in that spot, do you feel like you're your best self? Probably not. So we can start to explore the ways that disobedience to God might feel, but I would guess that none of you, when you're in those places, are necessarily thinking, gosh, am I being disobedient to God right now? Because I sure don't feel just like I ought these days. And so we have to explore what this looks like, and I'm going to share a little bit of my journey with you. This is not your journey, it's mine, but just as an example. So when I was in high school, and all of this is me looking backward and reflecting, and I'm still trying to figure it out, so this is by no means done. But when I was graduating high school, I couldn't decide if I was going to major in literature, which I love. I love to read. I've always loved that stuff. Or should I major in engineering and make sure I could pay the bills? Now, paying your bills is a good thing, and being productive is not a terrible thing in the world. But I chose that one, and got to engineering school, and all the way through my freshman year was just on this sort of ups and downs of gloomy days of why was I here, and then other days where it seemed okay. So at the end of that year, I transferred schools altogether because that one only had engineering degrees, and I thought maybe if I want to try something else, I should go where there might be another option. Now, I went ahead and finished engineering school anyway, but the whole time, I had this sense that this is probably not where I ought to be. Now, I didn't think about it this way then. Looking back, I had chosen a path of trying to pursue wealth as opposed to trying to live perhaps into the passions that God had put within me. And so what was the result was these kind of gloomy days that kind of came and went. Well, then I got into the working world, and about 6 months in, I think it was, I found myself one day laying in my corporate apartment. And if you've ever been in an apartment that your company rents you when you're traveling, there's nothing in it, really. And so I was laying in this gloomy gray room after I'd been to the emergency room because I had back spasms that had just wiped me out that day. And when I got to the emergency room, they said, "How did you injure your back? When did the pain start?" And I said, "Well, I had a plate of scrambled eggs, and I was setting them down on the table today." Does that sound like something that should give you a horrible back injury? The doctor didn't think so either. But it went away within the week, and I was fine for a few months, and then it came back, and then it went away, and then it came back, and then it stopped going away. And this was like a 3-year journey of going to doctor after doctor, and they all asked me the same questions. Is the pain radiating down your legs? Nope, it's just right there in the middle of the back. And it was real pain. They sent me to physical therapy. One guy was ready to cut me open and fix me. It got really bad when I spent a day and a half in the hospital. I had gone on a golf outing. Like, I still kept moving. I went and played golf with a bunch of people I work with, and my golf swing was like this because I couldn't move my back. And then we went and we were gathering, and I collapsed and I had to call the ambulance. It was terrible. And it just kept getting worse. I had a Ford Probe, purple, metallic. I love that car. But it was low and I couldn't get down into it anymore. So I got rid of it and got a truck, but I didn't like it. Was terrible. The whole thing was bad. And finally, my boss said to me, "You need to read this book." And it was a book that a doctor wrote who suggested that for some people, not people with an actual injury, but the scrambled egg people, we may not actually have an injury, it may be how we deal with tension. And once I read the book, my back pain almost disappeared immediately. Not right away, it took a little bit. And to this day, it's been more than a decade. I'm mostly fine. Some days it's kind of stiff and other things, but I don't have that level of pain. And what I figured out then was that some of you get ulcers, and some of you get migraines, and some of you have other issues when you get stressed. And I thought, oh, well, mine just turns into back pain. That was until this week when I read this text that talked about disobedience and looked back and said, well, maybe it's not just stress. I haven't figured this out yet, but maybe, just maybe, that back pain was in part because I was chasing this path of wealth and something different than what God maybe had called me to be in this world. Now, the other part that I wrestled and struggled with in that job was I had days, about every 6 months again, I would sit down and write in my journal about how terrible my work was, and how purposeless it was, and all of my struggles with that, because I never could connect I never tried to connect faithfulness to the work that I was doing. And by the end of it, even when I knew I was going to seminary, I had what I didn't know then but know now were symptoms of depression. So all of this went together, and I can look back now and say, well, maybe it's because I was being disobedient. Now, going to seminary was not the solution to the problem. It helped a lot, because it gave me a different sense of purpose. But no one had ever come and told me, hey, you can be purposeful in your job no matter what your job is. There can be something faithful in what you do. And I look back now and remember that there were people that would come to my cube to talk to me about all kinds of issues, struggles they were having in life, ethical questions they had at work, and I always wondered, why are they coming and talking to me? And I never thought, maybe that's why God put me here. Nobody ever helped me connect those two things. So I maybe could have had a different sense of faithfulness and purpose in that place that would have allowed me not to have all that pain and struggle, because I would have been living in that space in a different way that was more obedient to God. Now, all of this I just figured out this week, so I haven't totally got it all nailed down yet. But the other thing I have noticed in my own spiritual journey is that I really do have physical aches and pains that disappear when it seems like I'm more in line with what God's got in mind for me. The most recent one has been what I call preacher's shoulder. I've been to the doctor, they told me it was tendonitis or something, but there's some days, I go weeks when it doesn't bother me, but then sometimes by the end of Sunday I can barely get my arm up over my head, and so, and it's only when I'm preaching, that's why I call it preacher's shoulder. And so I don't know, it could be that I'm just getting older, but it could be that I need to pay attention to how it is I'm listening to God, and maybe I'm not listening as closely as I ought to be. And I share all of that to say sometimes our disobedience to God might feel like, that slouchy, guilty feeling, and sometimes it might feel like that red face, go hide feeling. Sometimes it might be that feeling, and sometimes it might be that we're like, gosh, I don't remember hurting my shoulder, but it sure is bothering me today. And I think maybe what we're ought to do is listen to those things as little prompts to say, what is God up to in the world, and where am I at in that journey, and how might I listen to that better? Now, all of this wrestling I've been doing all week with disobedience grew out of this letter from Paul. Now, if we remember who Paul was, he at one point describes himself as kind of like the super Jew. He has, in this text today, he talks about being of the tribe of Benjamin. In another part, he talks about kind of being the Pharisee of Pharisees who never missed a point of the law. Does that sound like a guy that's struggling with guilt? No. And then, he's the guy that stands there and is watching their coats or whatever while one of Jesus' followers gets stoned to death. And then he graduates to being the guy who goes and gets letters and breathes threats and murder against Christians and goes and tries to hunt them down. In this day and age, what do we call someone who breathes threats and murder and goes and tries to hunt down people of another faith? Terrorist. That's a strong word we don't maybe want to apply to Paul, but if you read the story of what he's doing, it's terrible. He is just so angry and mad that he's going to go hunt these people down and make sure they get locked up, and it's totally okay if we stone them sometimes as well. So the guy that writes this letter about disobedience has been about as disobedient as you can be as a human being, getting into this space of murder and hatred and anger. And he is the very same guy then that can say that all people are imprisoned in this disobedience, but that God's mercy then applies to who? All people. He uses all twice in the last verse that we heard. He says all are imprisoned in disobedience, but then God's mercy comes to all. Does he have like a little bulleted list of who is exempted from that? No, it's for everybody. All people. So Paul, I imagine, was writing this as thinking, even me. Me, the guy that used to chase down people. Me that was so mad. Me that was so contrary to who God had called me to be. Even me, I am included in that all. So as he writes about this mercy, he has experienced all of it. And I can imagine that he had stages of guilt and stages of shame. And he had that, and maybe, well, he does talk about having a thorn in his side that won't go away. Maybe that's a metaphor for some psychological, spiritual wrestling he's doing. Or maybe he also had preacher shoulder, or something like that, that was just sticking with him all the time as he was trying to work through what it meant to be faithful. Because it is hard for us to listen to God, and we don't always get it right. Well, all of this, as he writes about it, is also remembering back to Jesus. Because Jesus, when he went to the cross, really was the recipient of all of the ways that we feel disobedience and that we express it. How do you think Peter felt after he denied Jesus and ran away? Terrible. He probably had that guilty thing and the shameful thing, all of it all wrapped up in one. Those that were so adamant that he go to the cross were shouting, crucify him, crucify him. So they had that going on, and every bit of the way we express disobedience landed on Jesus at the cross. And yet, he takes all of that and comes out the other side with mercy. All people disobedient, and who gets mercy? All people. That's what Jesus does. So, as Paul can look back on that and state this truth that says all are disobedient and all receive mercy, what can that say to us as we go out into the world? And for me, it comes back to those two questions I started with. How does disobedience feel, and how does it look? First, how does it feel? If we pay attention to ourselves and pray and read Scripture and gather and worship and are attuned to the ways that God speaks to us, hopefully we can start to get past some of those things and believe that mercy is actually a thing. Because part of our struggle as people of faith, I think, is we just really don't believe that we're forgiven. I've had, as just a little example, people come up to me and say, oh, Pastor, I'm really sorry for this thing that I did. And I'll say, what did you do? And then they'll tell me, and I'll be like, when did you do that? Because they did it, it's something they felt they did to me, and I'm like, I don't even remember that happening. But they've been carrying that around for however long, and who's that impacting when they carry that around? Yeah. Just them, because nobody else is worried about it, right? And that's a simple example, but when you think on a much bigger scale, some of us carry around lifelong guilts and shames and struggles, and what Paul is telling us is, God's mercy is there for you. You are forgiven and beloved by God. Get over it and go out and live as if that is true. Trust that Jesus has forgiven you and died and been raised so that you can live. So that is the first bit of it, is believing and trusting that this mercy really is for all of us. But then we go out and live in the world, and sometimes we do see what is probably, most of the time it's some gray area, but there's a lot of disobedience to God that other people might be feeling. And how do we live into that space? I would have loved for somebody to come into my office and say, there's a way of living faithfully in this job that might help you out a little bit. And that would have made some connections for me that would have made I might have still be doing that job, because I would have been able to live it in a different way. So one thing we can do is pay attention to how God is at work in people's lives around us and point that out and encourage them and inspire them to live differently in the world so that they can be whole and well. But then there are also times where we see disobedience that needs a different story to be told. Our current mood of hatred and violence and racism is such a time. We can sit by and say nothing, but I don't think that's what God calls us to do. God calls us to have a voice of hope and a voice of joy and a voice of love and a voice that calls a thing what it is. That's part of our Lutheran understanding, is to call evil evil when we see it. And so part of our going out into the world and seeing disobedience is to call a thing what it is, but also then to talk about grace and mercy and forgiveness. Who does grace, mercy, and forgiveness apply to? All people. If we shove everybody away and can't relate to anybody, how are they going to know that unless we bring that with us? And so as we go today, I hope that all of you can know when we gather at this table who's invited? All people, because the gift is for everybody. And that mercy lands on us then and frees us to go out into the world and be courageous people that can encourage, inspire, challenge, and do all of the things it takes to help people know that God loves them so they can have that transformation in their lives. Amen.